we are at this point. Actually, we'll be covering the topic of protecting personal data in the age of privacy regulations. First of all, several things about myself. I've been working in the privacy field for the last 4 years. Before that, I was marketing executive in global corporations for over 14 years and a half. In different marketing roles, but basically I have a growth hacking attitude, which is something not so usual seen in a privacy consultant, but the idea is that privacy is a business enabler, and this is how we approach our consulting projects. We work with over 150 customers right now in different verticals. And we are working together with a team of experts in order to cover all privacy compliance requirements, starting from legal to process management, IT security, business operations, digital transformation, and so on. I hold the certification for Maastricht University, Netherlands, for data protection officer from European Center of Privacy and Cybersecurity. And also I have two GDPR online courses and one certified data protection officer course. You can ask questions whenever you want. You can raise your hand and I will try to address your questions. Now, let's start talking about GDPR. So one of the first things that I always start is this meme, because many customers ask why was it so necessary to have such a strict regulation like GDPR? And the answer was that many companies started collecting excessive quantities of data that were used to psychologically profile their users and customers and prospects and so on. But actually, by profiling these customers, they were able also to predict their purchases, their wishes, and even their political convictions. And that's a big issue, because that's very intrusive from a privacy perspective and from a private life perspective, because these algorithms, at some point, they can feed you with the right content in order to change your opinion about either a product, a service, or a political direction. And this is why it is so dangerous, and this is why it was needed to have such a regulation. And this regulation, what is very interesting is that it inspired other worldwide regulations, new regulations in Brazil, in Canada, in Russia, in China, by the way, in Turkey, we saw some new regulations and so on. But new regulations appear throughout the world, which are based on GDPR principles. Now, if we are to actually make an analysis of why is this happening, just imagine, look at the year in this slide, 2012, which is quite some time ago. Okay, in 2011, Target, which is basically a chain of cash and carry stores in the United States, introduced an algorithm to actually profile customers based on what they were buying. But at some point, they managed, the algorithm evolved because it was based on artificial intelligence. The algorithm evolved and managed basically to predict that different shoppers were pregnant. And the most interesting fact is that at some point, it was able to detect that teenager was pregnant before her father realized this fact. So this is super intrusive. And that's why when such news emerge, I mean, scandals explode through all the world about how intrusive these algorithms were. But if you think that this is not so intrusive and not so dangerous, imagine what happened when when Cambridge Analytica appeared. Again, this is something from 2015, 2016, so 5-6 years ago. Imagine the fact that 5 or 6 years ago, we basically had a company, data intelligence company, was able to aggregate data and feed it to a predictive algorithm based on artificial intelligence, which was able to really profile users on what and visitors on what they were doing. At some point, Cambridge Analytica monitored around 4,000 data points on each United States citizen. And this was just an example. Moreover, they basically bragged about what they were doing during a conference where they showed how they were able to influence the 2016 caucus in the early stage of United States elections, when they shown how much they can find out about people just from reading their actions in the internet. Not only about the posts that they were posting, about what they were doing on social media, but what also they were doing on internet, different internet sites, what types of content they were consuming, what activities they were doing, what photos they posted, and so on. And today algorithms evolved even more. I mean, imagine that when you post a photo on the internet, actually there are algorithms that can read your face and understand whether you are happy, whether you are sad. They can read your face. By the way, Facebook has a feature that they are communicating related to the fact that when you are uploading a photo on Facebook, they are checking out everybody's photo, everybody's faces in that photo, and they are notifying people if their photo has been uploaded, which means that basically Facebook is deploying the AI algorithm, the AI facial recognition algorithm on every photo which is uploaded into the network, which is quite intrusive, okay? Now, the dangerous thing of actually doing something like this is that you step into the lives of people. You don't have any more intimacy, because if, for example, in such a photo, someone is just walking around and is caught by the camera, an AI algorithm will know that that person was at that time when the photo was taken, which is read from the EXIF information of the photography, and correlate this with different events in the lifetime of that person. So this is used to feed the so-called data cubes, okay? So this is why you need a tougher legislation, because this type of behavior is cannot be accepted. It's very dangerous, and it can lead to mass manipulation, as it has been seen in what Cambridge Analytica was doing and in what other political marketing companies are doing throughout the world. We see it every day. We see a lot of manipulation. This manipulation is based on personal data, which is proactively fed to these algorithms. Now, in order to stop this, you need a more advanced legislation, such as GDPR, which is forcing companies to increase transparency. Many people wrongfully think that GDPR is about consent. No, that's a nonsense. GDPR is about respecting the lives of people by mandating organizations to process personal data in a compliant manner. GDPR is based on the human rights, as they are exposed in the United Nations Treaty and in the Treaty of the Foundation of the European Union. But it's based on the same human rights which stand right at the cornerstone of the United Nations. And these algorithms are using personal data. So if we manage to mandate organizations to process this personal data in a compliant manner, these algorithms won't be able to do their job, and they won't be able to basically predict the future of what different data subjects would be doing. So basically, they wouldn't be so intrusive. That's the whole mantra behind GDPR. Now, what is exactly this General Data Protection Regulation? It's a regulation covering the so-called European Economic Area, which is EU plus several other countries like Norway, Liechtenstein, and so on. But the General Data Protection Regulation, which is for countries in the European Union, they are not only addressed to European Union, they are also covering organizations, or let's say data controllers, who can also be persons who are processing data of people in the EU. People in the EU doesn't mean necessarily European Union citizens. They can be European Union visitors or immigrants. It doesn't matter. Once you are in the EU, you are protected by GDPR. So if an organization is offering you products or services or is performing monitoring on you, then that organization needs to comply to all GDPR principles. GDPR is not something new. We saw legislations based on privacy starting in the 50s with the human rights, but then we also have the directive, the European Union directive related to processing of personal data, which appeared in 1995. That directive was transposed in the legislation of every country in the European Union, and then we actually saw legislations appeared in several other countries, and GDPR was drafted in 2016. It was published in 2016, and it entered into action in 2018. Versus the previous legislation, the previous directive, GDPR brings clarity in terms of personal privacy rights, increased duty for protecting personal data. What has new is the mandatory breach reporting in 72 hours from detection, plus significant penalties for non-compliance. And this is what GDPR was communicated, heavy fines and so on. But is just as an anecdote, the United States issued much bigger fines for privacy compliance breach than European Union, several times higher. Okay, so despite the fact that GDPR was communicated to be around fines, GDPR is not around fines. It's about compliance and education. And yes, only in the end, we see the so-called enforcement. But once we need to understand GDPR, we need to understand some of the terms. First of all, I will talk about the legal term, and then I will talk about the explanation. So the legal term is about what is personal data. Personal data is any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, which is the so-called data subject. Now, the definition could stop here. What we see starting from this is just an explanation, such as an identified natural person is one who can be identified directly or indirectly. What it means directly? Directly means, hey, here is a photo. John is in the photo. That's a direct identification. Indirect identification means, hey, here is a photo. I don't understand who is in this photo, but probably someone or somewhat like a machine could understand who exactly is in that photo. Now, this means that this is a very, very large topic, because this any makes things to be really, really hard. Many organizations basically compared GDPR with ISO. It's nothing to do with an ISO, because ISO it has some really standardized terms, but this is very large, because at some point it means that yes, personal data can be something quite abstract like IP. IP is considered to be personal data because it can lead to the identification of an individual who was behind that IP. The registration plate on a number in a car is also personal data, because at some point, at some hour, that car is being driven by a person, and so on. So it's any information that could lead to the identification of an individual directly or indirectly. So the definition, the real simple definition of personal data, and this is not only for GDPR, is for legislations around the world, is any information that can lead directly or indirectly to the identification of a natural person, not necessarily by yourself. Because I saw this mistake a lot of times, such as, hey, we don't understand why is this personal data, because we don't know that person. You don't have to know that person. But if a machine or someone can identify that person, it means that yes, it is personal data. I have a question, which means a picture of a house also is considered to be personal data. Well, it depends, because at some point in that house, we could have several other persons. But if you're putting, for example, a picture of a single person living in that house, then yes, that can be considered personal data. Okay, or if you actually publish things related to that house that can lead to the identification of a person, such as who is the unique owner. If we have, for example, several owners or a company owning that house, there's not a problem. But if that house can lead to the identification of an individual, then yes, it becomes personal data. Thank you very much for your question. What is processing? Again, the definition is very large. So just a second before moving to this, I want to focus on still on the topic of personal data. If we have, there is a regulation in EU, say related to data transfers, which says where personal and non-personal data in a data set are inextricably linked, this regulation shall not prejudice the application of regulation EU 2016-679, which is GDPR. The other thing related to the framework of the free flow, we have another thing mentioned in the law. If non-personal data part of personal data parts are inextricably linked, the data protection rights and obligations stemming from GDPR fully apply to the whole mixed data set. So basically, if in a data set you have personal data and non-personal data inextricably linked, the whole data set becomes personal data. Just to give you an example, if, for example, you have a CRM entry in a CRM, okay? So in the CRM, you have a company like Acme Inc. And in that company, you have profiled the general manager, Mr. John Doe, okay? Everything related to the data set of John Doe becomes personal data, such as the activities performed in the account, email sent to John Doe, phone call we had with John Doe, and so on. Everything becomes personal data, okay? The whole data set. Now, this is really important in order to basically understand the challenge, because the challenge is related to data sets which are part of bigger data sets. And if you have a personal data which is inextricably linked to the other data sets, the whole data set becomes personal data. This is especially useful in the context of the so-called big data, okay? Because if for a person, and I've seen this mistake a lot, people were saying, wait a minute, so we collect a lot of data from different data subjects, and we aggregate the data and we create information related to behavior, online behavior, purchases, purchase category, and so on. But at some point, and keep this in mind, we say, hey, we want to use this data for analytics. The question is, how do we anonymize it? The simple answer would be, hey, I'm just eliminating the unique identifiers, such as name, surname, ID, address, phone number, email, and so on. And we have just the pure behavior set. The problem is that if that behavior is unique and it can lead to identification of a natural person directly or indirectly, it still remains personal data. What you did an action of pseudonymization, not of anonymization. So this is the fine tuning of what personal data is and is not. The fine tuning is related to the fact that a lot of the data that you have on your computers, on your servers, is personal data and you might not know it. This is why you need to analyze and you need to put yourself in the shoes of the person. You need to understand what data could lead to the identification of a certain person. Because if that data can lead directly or indirectly to the identification of a certain person, it is for sure personal data. Good. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask these questions. What is processing? Processing, again, the definition is the following: any operation or set of operations which is performed on personal data or on sets of personal data, whether or not by automatic means. Again, the definition could stop here. But we have some explainings, such as collection, recording, organization, structuring, storage. I'll pause here for a second. Storage. We had a lot of discussions with customers saying, hey, we have some really old data, but it was collected before GDPR. GDPR does not apply to it. If you store personal data, you process personal data. This means that GDPR applies to you, okay? So storage is processing. It doesn't matter when the data was collected. If it was collected 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago. We had discussions with big insurance companies who had insurance policies which were 80 years old, but that person was still alive. So actually it was still personal data. It was part of the history of that person. So yes, that is personal data, okay? So if you store data, it means you process data. Then we have adaptation or alteration, retrieval, consultation. What does this mean? If you search a person name on Google, for example, you process personal data, but GDPR might not apply to you. If you do it on the so-called household grounds, this meaning related to household activities or personal activities on social media, GDPR does not apply to you. But if, let's say, you are a recruiter at Acme Inc., and if you meet a person and you think, hey, this person might be quite a good fit for a company, if you're searching for the history of that person on Google or on LinkedIn or on Facebook, then yes, you are processing personal data, okay? And GDPR might apply to you because actually in this case, you are doing processing on a person that you met in the context of the business, okay? So you need to understand this, that processing of personal data is anything you do with personal data, okay? Anything. And if you're doing in the context of your business or as a data controller, GDPR applies to you. Let me give you another fine-tuning of GDPR, a good example. In Netherlands, a grandmother posted a photo of her grandson, which you could say it was, how should I say, personal processing. It was in the context of household and so on. However, the grandmother did not talk to her daughter, who was the mother of that kid. And the mother requested the grandmother to delete the photo from Facebook. Now, everything went to court, okay? And in the court, the judge said the following. The grandmother posted the photo on Facebook. Yes, you might say that GDPR does not apply to you because it's on household and or personal premises. But the photo was unrestricted, so anybody could have access to it. It was not restricted to the family because you can restrict content, for example, on Facebook on who can see it. Yeah, so it was unrestricted access, so everybody could see it. So the judge said, no, the exception does not apply here, and GDPR applies here. So in the context of GDPR, you need to have a legal ground to process this data. So what is the legal ground? The legal ground can be only consent. Consent must be expressed by the mother or father of the kid. Consent was not received, so the grandmother had to delete the photo by court order. Just to understand how fine GDPR is in this case and how restrictive is this, let's say, household exception. Okay, so basically processing of personal data is anything that you actually do with personal data. Let's go through the principle. There are 6 principles plus some other derivatives, but the main principles are 6, and they are mentioned in Article 5 in GDPR. These principles are the principle of lawfully, fairly, and transparency. What does this mean? Process lawfully. It must respect all the laws which are how should I say, which are coming for this processing. So, for example, if you are processing the personal data of a person from Germany, you also need to respect the German laws, not only the GDPR. Okay, the same if you're, for example, for Italy, the same for France. You need to respect all the legislation which is in place. Fairly, it means that the processing must do good for humankind. You cannot do processing which harms people. And in a transparent manner. Transparency means that you actually need to communicate to the data subject what you're doing with their data. So you need to mention at least, based on Article 12, 13, and 14 in GDPR. You need to mention, first of all, who you are as a data controller, and you need to be precise. In transparency, as a request means you need to be super precise. You need to say, hey, who you are, not like the owner of the website, blah, blah.com. No, you need to say, hey, we are the company Acme Inc., based in Singapore, and we process your personal data. You need to mention who you are as a data controller. Or if you are several data controllers, you actually need to mention this. So we are a group of data controllers or joint data controllers, okay? You need to mention exactly the data categories that are being processed, the purpose of processing, and the legal ground for this. You cannot do generic expression. I've seen so many, and we are going to address this. I've seen so many mistakes related to how organizations chose to publish their privacy notices, saying that we might process your personal data on these purposes, we might collect. No, you need to be really precise. Yes, we are doing this, we are doing that in this context. And you actually need to match the purpose of the processing with the legal ground for processing. Based on your consent, we will process your personal data in order to deliver you the newsletter. Based on our legitimate interest, we will log on your online activities in order to protect the website from different hacking attempts, and so on. Then you need to mention to whom you're transferring data. What is the role of the organization you're transferring data to, such as data processors or data controllers, and why? You need to mention for how long do you plan to process personal data, and why, and what are the rights of the data subjects, and how can they exercise their rights. So this is the first principle. Second principle is collected for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes. This means purpose limitation. Purpose limitation means you cannot use blank cards, such as, we are collecting your data for marketing purposes. What is a marketing purpose? It can be, yes, I am going to send you a newsletter. Great. Hey, I'm going to send you an SMS. Okay, at 3 a.m. in the morning. Wait, it's not okay. I'm going to call you. Okay, at 1 a.m. in the morning. Well, that's not okay. So you need to basically be really explicit related to the processing. What exactly is the processing? Yes, I'm delivering you a newsletter. Yes, I'm delivering you SMS. Yes, I'm delivering different samples. Yes, I'm using cookies, and so on. So you need to be explicit here. Legitimate means you need to have at least one of the legal grounds from the 6 legal grounds that I'm going to mention in the next slide. You need to have at least one legal ground for processing. The next principle is the principle of data minimization. So data needs to be adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary. This means that you cannot collect data based on, hey, I might use it in the future. No. Do I process a newsletter? Yes. Then I need your email, of course, maybe name, surname to customize the newsletter to you. Hey, I want to retarget you, then I'm going to use your navigation history on my website, and so on. Accurate and where necessary kept up to date. This is data clarity. This means that basically you need to make sure that you do your best efforts to keep personal data correct. So if somebody says, hey, my data is incorrect, you suspend the processing of personal data, and then you basically check out if the data is correct, and you do correct it if it needs to be corrected, and only then you continue processing. The next principle is data limitation. This means kept for no longer than is necessary. Storage limitation, sorry. You need to keep data only for as long as necessary, either required by law or by your processing. You cannot say, I'm going to keep this data indefinitely. No, every data needs to have an expiration date. It's just like food. I'm not kidding. I'm doing this comparison. So basically, if your data stays too long on your servers, you actually might get a fine. So make sure you define retention times, which can be motivated by either by the law, that you need to keep it for a number of years to show that you processed it correctly, or the law requires you to keep this data for a number of years, or simply you just want to retarget some users based on the data they have, but you need to be explicit, okay? And remember, storage is also processing, so you need to have a legal ground for that as well. And the last one is data security, processed in a manner that ensures appropriate security. A data breach, it doesn't necessarily mean that only a data breach occurs when hackers hack you. No, a data breach can mean also a lost laptop. If that information on the laptop was not encrypted or backed up in the database, then you have a data breach. If you send an email with everybody in CC and people didn't know each other, that also is a data breach. So again, we have many definitions for data breach, but the idea is that the data breach is an unexpected loss, alteration, access to personal data. Okay, so it's very wide, the term. Again, if you have questions, just put them up or raise your hands, and I'm going to address your questions anytime. Then we have legal grounds. The first legal ground is consent. Consent is very limitative. I would say it's the worst legal ground to use, because you need to use it only for processes that for processing operations that are not critical for your business. Just let me give you an example. Consent can be used, for example, for cookies. Your website also works without cookies. Consent can be used for newsletter. Your business can run without a newsletter, but you cannot use consent for example, to enter into a contract. You cannot use consent for human resources operations, and I'm going to explain you why. Consent has some very strong limitations, such as it needs to be freely given. This means that there should be equal relationship between the requester and the provider of the consent. So you cannot have any pressure, let's say, from the data controller requesting consent. So that's why, for example, consent cannot be used usually in human resource operations, because always the employer has the upper hand. So when employer asks you for consent, you feel pressured to deliver that consent. So that's not freely given. Also, when you are to receive a benefit, or if you don't give us consent, we won't be able to. This is also negative pressure. So consent might be challenged here. This is why consent should be used only for marketing operations that you can do without. Otherwise, you need to use one of the other 5 legal grounds for processing, such as necessary for the performance of a contract. Also, there's fine-tuning here about the word necessary. You actually need to demonstrate that you need to put processing in the contract, and you need to process personal data as part of the contract. You cannot put in a contract something like, yes, you can buy our products at 20% discount, but hey, you need to subscribe to our newsletter as well. No, that's not necessary for the performance of a contract. So you need to determine that the processing is necessary for the performance of the contract. You cannot put any clause, just drop a clause in the contract, and yes, you have a legal ground for processing, okay? Legal obligation means you need to respect the law. So the law mandates you to process data, such as storing data or collecting national identification numbers in specific cases and so on. Vital interest means you need to save the life of a person, and you cannot ask consent or contract to save that person's life, so you just save her or his life. Public interest means that public sector organizations, based on different law, have a public interest to process certain personal data. This was the case for example, with some intrusive I wouldn't say intrusive technologies, but questionnaires related to COVID cases in the family, questionnaires related to traveling, but only if the laws allowed those companies to perform this. So usually a public authority can give guidance related to public interest processing, and of course the authorities can use public interest to process personal data. Legitimate interest means a processing which can be processing based on legitimate interest, means that the data subject should expect that processing to come, such as, hey, we worked in the past together, and now I'm sending you a reactivation newsletter or reactivation letter. Hey, dear customer, we used to do such good business in the past. Do you want to continue? Or, hey, you are a good employee of mine, I'd like to think about working with us again. But at the same time, you need to offer an opt-out. Basically, the data subject should be able to say, hey, I don't want to receive any more of your communication. Don't contact me anymore. Legitimate interest also can be used, for example, at an event where you plan to take photos. You cannot obtain consent for 5,000 people, but in the end, you can ask, you can say, hey, I'm going to take photos at this event. You should expect the fact that we are taking photos. But by the way, if you don't want to appear in these photos, here's the procedure how not to appear. Either go to that corner or notify this person here not to take photos of you, or if we publish photos, you have the right to request us to delete that photo. Basically, the right to object to certain processing of personal data. So this is usually how legitimate interest works. So these legal grounds are quite similar in different legislations throughout the world. You'll see a small comparison, which was done by IAPP, which is the International Association of Privacy Professionals. So this is why GDPR stated them, but again, they are also used in other legislations throughout the world as well. Now, we talked about legal grounds. Once you have determined what are the processing, first of all, you need to understand the fact that you actually need to understand if you are to become GDPR compliant or privacy compliant. First of all, you need to audit. You need to understand what is happening in your organization. Because I saw many organizations saying, hey, we are just going to identify personal data, we are going to use a discovery tool, and that's it. The truth is that when you're performing the real audit, this is when you find out what is happening in your organization. And this is called data flow management. There are many software which are doing these design flows, these data flows. Every major organization in privacy, offering privacy software, they always have their data flows software. Me, as a best practice, I'm using Visio or other design tools as well. You could also use the open source alternatives, Draw.io. But the idea is to structure it. I'm structuring into data subject, data controller, and data processors. So, and then I start actually to understand how is the data flowing, and I'm taking it by department. So this is just a recommendation. Okay, this is, for example, for IT and IT tools. This is an example from a company who basically has some on-prem tools and some external tools. In the on-prem tools, we have several monitoring tools, payroll servers, an email server, and other tools. We have an internal portal where the data subject can deliver some messages and feedback and requests and so on. And then we have several service providers, 2 internet lines, and there you can see Microsoft with Microsoft 365 and Azure. But the idea is that you actually need to understand who are all the players in the equation and what is their role, either a data controller or a data processor. Okay, so once you actually understand what is happening, you need to map how the data is going. And you can see that I put some high level. This is very high level. I didn't go into details, but you actually need to pull all the personal data categories that are being exchanged inside the organization. I'm putting here, you see, just as an example, name, surname, username, and logs coming from the data subject. Then we have hosting data, backup data that is being sent. So I'm grouping it into a whole big category, but actually need to be able to drill down and explain exactly what is happening in each of these transfers inside the organization and outside the organization to better understand the roles of data controls, data processors. This is also used basically to better understand the risks. So you need to identify all the risks in your organization and address each risk with technical and organizational measures. Now, if we were to talk about data controllers and data processors, with each data processor, you need to sign a so-called data protection agreement. The good thing is that European Commission delivered some guidance, a template for the so-called standard contractual clauses for controller to processor relationship according to Article 28. So this is for inside EU or EEA transfers. We also have the standard contractual clauses for international transfers outside EU. But in this case, you can use also the template for the controller to processor according to Article 28. Anyway, the idea is why you also need to do this mapping, this data mapping exercise, this data flow exercises, to be able to explain to data subjects based on their language and on their understanding what you're doing with the personal data. So here comes the magic of privacy notices. As I told you, you need to say who you are. So basically your company, what you do, and some contact details. The personal data you're processing, and you actually need to list all the personal data categories. And you also need to mention the categories which are generated, not only collected. Because yes, you might collect from person name, surname, and email, but then you're generating purchasing, you're generating logon data, you're generating audit data, and so on, behavioral data. You need to mention these part of your transparency obligation. Then you need to mention what you're doing with it, the object, the scope, and the legal ground for processing. And you need to match each purpose with a legal ground. You cannot say, we are processing your data in order to set up your online account, allow you to buy products, deliver your services, deliver your support, deliver your newsletter. And the legal grounds for this is necessity to perform contractual obligation, legal obligation, and legitimate interest. No, you need to actually map each purpose with the according legal ground. Then you need to mention what you do with it, to whom you share the personal data and why, who are processors, who are controllers, who are joint controllers, and you need to mention international transfers and safeguards. Just as a small notice, when you're offering a portal, okay, if an organization can view data on that portal, this is considered to be transfer. So access is also transfer. Transfer, by the way, is not defined in EU legislation or basically in any privacy legislation in a specific manner. So this is why transfer can be considered also access from another country. Then you need to define a retention policy for how long you plan to process personal data and why, and clear retention timelines for each personal data category. You cannot do something generic like we are planning to process this data for as long as legislation allows us to. No, that's generic. You need to be very precise. 3 years, 2 years, 6 months, and why. And what are the applicable rights to the data subject? So basically what rights the data subject has, such as the right to access, rectification, deletion, objection, suspension of processing, export, and how he or she can basically exercise those rights. So you need to be really, really specific here because otherwise you risk to not respect the transparency obligation. Legitimate interest. Whenever you're doing a legitimate interest, usually the best way to do is to evaluate it. So first of all, you need to apply the purpose test. So what is the legitimate interest of the controller? Why do you actually need to process this data? Why is this useful? Whenever we are performing audits and whenever we are asking this question, we identify a lot of time that this processing is not so necessary. So basically, the data controller can do really good without this processing. Many of them have no idea why they are doing certain processing operations. Then you have the necessity test. Can a similar result be obtained without processing personal data? Today, I had a discussion with a customer who wanted to upload data of several customers into Google targeting lists in order to better target their ads. And I said, why do you need to do this? Because this is quite excessive. Why not simply use a generic category of customers on your Google Ads targeting and let the targeting do its job? Would the difference be so much? I mean, would you gain an extra 1 million euros from conversions? Because if yes, it's worth the risk. But if not, don't do it because this is excessive processing. And then you have the balancing test. What are the interests of the data subject? What can go bad? Usually this is the question that you can ask. What can go bad here? Might I have data subject who would be upset by this processing? Would I have a data subject who might complain about this processing, who might raise a complaint to the supervisory authority? Are there any rights that I can breach to this data subject? So there are a lot of questions that you need to ask, part of this legitimate interest. You have some templates, some guidance from different supervisory authority. One of the best is coming from UK, from ICO, Information Commissioner Office. Although UK is not part of EU anymore, it used to be, and ICO did a really great educational job, and they have some really good legitimate interest assessments templates that you can use, okay? But as a rule of thumb, don't use legitimate interest to avoid consent. If the data subject wouldn't consent to the processing, then legitimate interest cannot be used. This is a rule of thumb. It's not part of the law, but it's a best practice that we keep on repeating. Don't use legitimate interest just to avoid consent. Use legitimate interest only when you think that, yes, my customers or my data subjects might actually give me consent for this. Good. Record the processing activities. You need to document your activities. Part of the data flows, you identify the processing operations, but here in record the processing activities, you need to formally put it in a formal document, which needs to contain purpose of processing, category of individuals, and so on. This is an example that I'm providing for a high-risk operation. You'll see why I give this example. It's for facial gesture automatic assessment. Some recruitment agencies and some HR departments thought it was wise to actually deploy some software which would recognize the faces of the candidates and identify if they were lying or if they were nervous and so on. So let's take a look at if this processing is okay or not. So the business function is human resources. Purpose of processing clearly is recruitment. Categories of personal data. Now look how many categories we are actually processing. Emotion category, brows position, eyelids position, eye position, jaw position, lips position, head position, associated with probabilities. And we have a study, for example, from Sage Journals, because we have many inferences determined from these categories. Categories of recipients, we have processor and analytics companies, so third parties. How long do you plan to keep these 6 months post-recruitments? And we have a general description of TOMS. This means technical and organizational measures, such as encrypted storage, access control, only certain people can have access to this data, data minimization. I wouldn't agree with this. DPA, data protection agreement signed with the processor, privacy notice presented to the candidate. Lawful basis, processing is necessary in order to take steps at the request of the data subject prior to entering into a contract. So this means that the data subject comes to the organization, says, hey, I want to apply for this role. This means you might be able to invoke the fact that, yes, it's processing is necessary in order to take steps at the request of the data subject. Now we need to determine whether it is actually necessary, this, okay? Condition of processing special category data, it's employment, rights available to individual, access rectification. This means human intervention, because the data subject might say, yes, the machine made mistakes, that was not accurate, I need human intervention. And of course, erasure. We have the existence of an automated decision making, and the location of personal data is in HR recruitment and in processor backend. Now, the question, do we need to do the so-called DPA, data processing impact assessment, which is a formal way of analyzing whether you are breaching the rights of the individual for high-risk processing operations. Let me give you the DPA for this. Again, what are some of the risks? Usually the DPA is a really formal process. The outcome are documents 30 to 40 to 100 pages, because you need to make a really detailed analysis of all the risks. But I'm going to give you the bird's eye view of this DPA, which is outlined in this table. So what are some of the risks? For example, the data subject has a medical condition preventing the correct movement of facial muscles. Okay, you need to take this into consideration. Likelihood of harm is medium, but severity of harm is really high. So you should basically to offer the data subject the choice for human interaction, either automatic, either human. So if you deploy this, then the data subject would be able to say, yes, I want human interaction, I want to avoid the algorithm, and everything would be okay. The data subject might be tired, and he or she might receive an unfair evaluation, and the likelihood of harm and severity of harm might be high. You either offer the choice to request a human interaction, but however, if the person still chooses the algorithm and the algorithm makes mistakes, the effect is high and the residual risk still remains as high. So you cannot approve such a measure. And something really bad that can go really, really bad, especially nowadays that the world is so diverse. The data subject belongs to an ethnic minority that has different ways to express emotions, leading to unfair evaluation. Because the algorithm might not be trained to actually properly recognize an emotional response from a person belonging to a different culture. And this is natural. We have so many amazing ways to express our personalities and our emotions. And algorithms that are not trained to do this might take the wrong decision. So this is why the measure is not approved. And this is why you need to perform this impact analysis, because the result is that the operation is too risky to continue and you cannot do it. And yes, just to give you an example, many of these processing operations were halted due to the high risks and to discrimination that took place, really nasty discrimination that took place due to this implementation. And I'm personally, I'm against using artificial intelligence in recruitment processes to process candidate data, especially to process facial recognition, because it usually, as a rule of thumb, an artificial intelligence algorithm, if you're feeding personal data to an AI, it will always discriminate. It will always discriminate. So this is the general opinion on this. Now, this is an example, again, I think you'll receive this presentation of several legislation around the world which are compared. However, what is really important is this link coming from International Association of Privacy Professionals. It's a privacy law mapping chart. It's a really great resource because it gives you a bird's eye view on different articles related to the rights to access, correct, so to the individual rights, to the business obligations, to the scope of processing, and how enforcement can be done. So you can see if you are processing personal data from different countries, you need to obey, by the way, all the legislations and all the laws. You need to make sure where to relate this in the law. So this gives you a great resource just to be able to see which laws are impacting which processing from which countries. So in order to basically better understand what it can happen. In the end, I would like to focus on how you can basically process, how you can determine whether you're doing correct processing or what you should be auditing as part of your compliance efforts. So, for example, we developed at Tudor Galos Consulting, we developed our own methodology. Privacy compliance means that you actually need to start with the GDPR audit or with the privacy audit. So you need to basically understand what is happening. We are also working privacy consulting. This means the one-on-one consultation on specific processing operations, such as the DPA, which needs to be done. But then you need to do the data inventory management, the privacy impact assessment. You need to develop the necessary data protection policies. These policies are considered to be the so-called soft controls, rules that employees need to respect in order to demonstrate compliance to privacy obligations or to GDPR obligation. Then you need to do the risk management, as you've seen in the DPA slide. So basically, each risk, how you can quantify it from severity and likelihood to happen. You need to have a strategy for data breach management. Strategy means that when the data breach occurs, and you saw that I used the right when, not if, but when. Each of us during our lifetime will go through a data breach. This is how the probability matrix is looking. So each of us will go through a data breach. So you need to know what to do when it happens. So you need not to determine which is the team, who is in the team, what needs to be done, what are the processes, what you should look for, how to develop the report, and so on. And you need to rehearse it, because if not, you have 72 hours to report a data breach. And part of those 72 hours, you need to collect a lot of data. Access request management, how to allow data subjects to exercise their rights. You need to train your people. This is privacy trainings. You need to do continuous training. It's not an excuse that your employees don't know the legislation. It's part of the accountability principle, which means that the data controller is accountable for all the processing operations which are part of their organization, done by their employees. Privacy notifications. I showed you what the privacy notification contains. So you need to inform data subjects about what is happening with their data. And in the end, compliance management or compliance reports. You need to always understand that you have to have a rhythm of business of different compliance meetings or Zoom meetings and so on to actually monitor compliance and develop reports, what happened, what changed, in order to see how you are managing compliance, because compliance is not a one-time job. It's a continuous job. You need to make sure that everything is in place. New legislation appears every day. New cases appear every day. New attack vectors appear every day. So you need to be on top of them. With this, we reach the end of our presentations.